Sarah had always enjoyed the tranquility of her night shifts at the office. The silence provided a perfect backdrop for her to catch up on work without the usual daytime interruptions. But on this particular night, something felt off. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, and the shadows seemed to move just out of the corner of her eye. Around midnight, Sarah noticed a janitor mopping the floor down the hall. She found it odd, as she had never seen anyone from the cleaning crew working this late before. His back was turned to her, his movements slow and deliberate. When she called out to him, he didn't respond. She shrugged it off, assuming he couldn't hear her. Hours passed, and the figure continued his slow, methodical mopping. Sarah's curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to approach him. As she got closer, the figure suddenly stopped and turned to face her. His eyes were hollow, and his skin had a pale, almost translucent quality. He stared at her with an expression that sent chills down her spine. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. The janitor's lips curled into a sinister smile, and he took a step toward her. Before she could react, the lights flickered and went out. When they came back on, the janitor was gone. Sarah stood there, heart pounding, convinced she had seen a ghost. For the rest of her shift, she kept glancing over her shoulder, dreading the thought of encountering the eerie janitor again. Sarah couldn't shake the image of the janitor's hollow eyes and sinister smile. As dawn approached, she gathered her belongings, eager to leave the eerie office behind. But just as she was about to exit the building, she felt a cold breeze and heard a faint sound of footsteps behind her. She turned quickly, expecting to see the janitor, but there was no one there. The empty hallway seemed to mock her fear. Determined not to let her imagination get the best of her, Sarah left the office and headed home. She tried to put the night's events out of her mind, but sleep did not come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the janitor's face. The next night, Sarah arrived at the office with a sense of dread. She went about her tasks, but her eyes kept darting to the hallway where she had seen the janitor. At midnight, she decided to take a break and make herself a cup of coffee. As she walked to the break room, she noticed the same janitor, once again mopping the floor. This time, he was closer. She mustered the courage to approach him again. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Can I ask you a question?" The janitor stopped mopping but didn't turn around. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. "Who are you?" she asked. Slowly, he turned to face her, and this time, his eyes were filled with a deep, unending sadness. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Before she could respond, the lights flickered again, plunging the hallway into darkness. When they came back on, the janitor was gone. Sarah stood there, trembling, her mind racing with questions. The next day, she confided in her friend and coworker, Tom. He listened intently, his expression serious. "You know, I've heard stories about this place," he said. "They say a janitor died here years ago, working the night shift. Some people claim to have seen his ghost." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What happened to him?" she asked. Tom shrugged. "No one knows for sure. Some say he had a heart attack, others say he was murdered. But they never found out who did it." Determined to uncover the truth, Sarah decided to do some research. She spent her lunch break at the local library, digging through old newspapers and records. Finally, she found an article about the janitor. His name was Harold, and he had indeed died under mysterious circumstances. The article mentioned that his death was never solved, and some believed his spirit was still trapped in the building, searching for justice. That night, armed with this new knowledge, Sarah returned to work. She was nervous but resolved to help Harold's spirit find peace. As midnight approached, she went to the hallway where she had seen him and called out, "Harold, I know what happened to you. I want to help you." The air grew colder, and she felt a presence behind her. She turned to see Harold standing there, his eyes full of sorrow. "Help me," he whispered. Sarah nodded. "I will, but you need to tell me what happened." Harold's form flickered, and suddenly, Sarah was no longer in the hallway. She found herself in a different time, watching Harold's final moments. He was mopping the floor when a shadowy figure approached him. There was a struggle, and then Harold collapsed, clutching his chest. The figure fled, leaving Harold to die alone. The scene faded, and Sarah was back in the hallway. Harold stood before her, his expression pleading. "Find him," he said. "Make him pay." With that, Harold vanished, leaving Sarah with a new mission. She knew she had to uncover the identity of Harold's killer and bring them to justice. Only then could Harold's spirit find peace, and the eerie presence that haunted the office be laid to rest. Determined to bring Harold justice, Sarah delved deeper into the building's history, speaking with longtime employees and scouring old files for any clues. Weeks passed, and her investigation slowly began to yield results. She discovered that a manager named Richard had been working the same shift as Harold on the night he died. Richard had a reputation for being cruel and was rumored to have a dark side. One evening, Sarah stayed late, waiting for Richard to leave. She confronted him in the parking lot, her heart pounding. "Richard, I know about Harold. I know you were there that night," she said, her voice steady. Richard's face paled. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped, but his eyes betrayed his fear. "Harold showed me," Sarah continued. "He showed me what you did." Richard's expression hardened. "You can't prove anything," he hissed. "Maybe not yet," Sarah replied. "But I will, and Harold won't let you rest until I do." Richard seemed to waver, his bravado faltering. Then, without warning, the air around them grew colder, and a shadowy figure appeared behind Richard. It was Harold, his ghostly form more solid than ever. Richard turned, his face contorted with terror. "You!" Richard gasped, stumbling backward. Harold's ghost reached out, and Richard screamed, clutching his chest. He fell to the ground, writhing in pain. Sarah watched in stunned silence as Harold's ghost leaned over Richard, whispering something she couldn't hear. Moments later, Richard lay still, his eyes wide open in death. Harold's ghost turned to Sarah, his expression one of gratitude and peace. "Thank you," he whispered. "Now I can rest." With that, Harold's ghost faded away, leaving Sarah alone in the cold night. She called the authorities, and Richard's death was ruled a heart attack. However, Sarah knew the truth. Justice had been served, and Harold's spirit was finally at peace. From that night on, the eerie presence that had haunted the office was gone. Sarah continued her night shifts without fear, knowing she had helped a lost soul find rest. And though the office remained silent and still, it was no longer a place of dread, but one of quiet resolution and peace. Jake had been working the night shift at the old factory for a few months. The building was a relic from the early 1900s, and it was said to be haunted. Jake never believed in ghosts, but the stories he heard from his coworkers were enough to make him wary. One night, as he was doing his rounds, he heard faint whispers echoing through the halls. He paused, straining to hear what was being said, but the words were indecipherable. The whispers seemed to come from the walls themselves, growing louder and more urgent as he moved deeper into the factory. Jake followed the sound to an old storage room. The door was ajar, and a cold draft seeped out, making him shiver. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty, save for a few dusty boxes and old machinery. Yet, the whispers grew louder, almost as if they were surrounding him. He shone his flashlight around the room, and the beam landed on a large mirror propped up against the wall. The surface of the mirror was fogged, but as he approached, he saw words slowly forming on the glass. "Get out!" Jake's heart raced as he stumbled backward, tripping over a box. He scrambled to his feet and fled the room, the whispers following him all the way back to his station. He spent the rest of the night with every light in the factory turned on, too terrified to continue his rounds. Jake couldn't shake the unsettling experience in the storage room. The words "get out" had haunted his thoughts all day. Determined to find answers, he returned to the factory the next night, armed with a camera and a voice recorder. He was determined to capture proof of the whispers and the chilling message on the mirror as midnight approached. Jake retraced his steps to the storage room. The whispers began again, growing louder and more frantic. He turned on his recorder and stepped inside, holding his breath as he scanned the room. The mirror stood where he had left it, its surface eerily blank. Jake walked up to the mirror and placed his hand on its cold surface. "Who are you?" he asked aloud. "What do you want?" The whispers intensified, swirling around him like a ghostly wind. Suddenly, the mirror fogged up again, and new words began to form. "Help us." Jake's heart raced as he tried to make sense of the message. "Help you? How?" he asked, his voice trembling. The whispers seemed to coalesce into a single, mournful voice. "Trapped. We are trapped." A chill ran down Jake's spine. He had heard rumors about the factory's dark past, about workers who had died in accidents or disappeared without a trace. He realized that the whispers were the voices of those restless souls, trapped within the walls of the factory. Determined to help them, Jake began researching the factory's history in earnest. He discovered that in the early 1900s, the factory had been the site of a terrible fire. Many workers had been trapped inside. Their bodies never recovered. The factory had been rebuilt, but the spirits of the lost workers had remained. Armed with this knowledge, Jake sought the help of a local historian and a medium. Together, they planned a ceremony to release the trapped spirits. They gathered in the factory one stormy night, setting up candles and placing offerings around the mirror. The medium began to chant, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the storm outside. Jake watched as the mirror began to fog up again, the words "thank you" appearing briefly before fading away. The whispers grew louder, then quieter, until they were nothing more than a faint echo as the ceremony ended. A heavy silence fell over the room. Jake felt a sense of peace settle around him, as if the very air had been cleansed. The medium smiled at him. "They are free now," she said softly. "You've given them the peace they sought." From that night on, the factory was no longer haunted. The whispers ceased, and the eerie atmosphere that had pervaded the building lifted. Jake continued to work his night shifts, but now he did so with a sense of fulfillment, knowing he had helped those lost souls find rest. The factory became a place of quiet productivity once more, its dark past laid to rest. And though Jake would never forget the chilling encounters he had experienced, he took comfort in knowing that he had brought light to a place of shadows, and peace to those who had been trapped in the darkness for far too long. Emily worked the night shift at a 24-hour diner. The pay was decent, and she enjoyed the quiet hours after midnight when the rush died down. One night, she was working alongside Mark, a new hire who seemed nice enough but kept mostly to himself as the night wore on. Emily noticed Mark becoming increasingly agitated. He kept glancing toward the back door, as if expecting someone to walk in. When she asked him if everything was okay, he just nodded and muttered something about needing to check on something. Mark disappeared into the back, and Emily went back to her duties. After about 20 minutes, she realized Mark hadn't returned. She went to the back to check on him but found the storage room empty. The back door was slightly open, letting in a cold breeze. Emily stepped outside, calling Mark's name, but there was no response. She felt a growing sense of dread as she realized something was very wrong. She decided to call their manager, but as she turned to go back inside, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the parking lot, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. It looked like Mark, but his eyes were wide with terror, and he was mouthing something she couldn't hear. She took a step toward him, but before she could reach him, he vanished into the darkness. Emily ran back inside and locked the door, her hands shaking. She waited for morning, praying for the shift to end. When the manager arrived, they searched the area but found no sign of Mark. He was never seen or heard from again. Emily couldn't stop thinking about Mark's terrified face and his sudden disappearance. Determined to find out what had happened to him, she started digging into the diner's history, speaking with other night shift workers and searching through old records. She learned that the diner had been the site of several mysterious disappearances over the years, all involving night shift employees. Rumors of a dark presence haunting the diner at night had circulated among the staff for decades. One name kept coming up in her investigation: William, a former cook who had vanished without a trace one stormy night many years ago. One evening, Emily returned to the diner after her shift to investigate further. She brought a flashlight and a camera, determined to document any strange occurrences. As she walked through the empty diner, she called out softly, "William, if you're here, please show yourself. I want to help." The air grew cold, and a faint whisper seemed to echo through the room. Emily followed the sound to the storage room where she had last seen Mark. She felt a chill as she entered the room, the flashlight flickering as she scanned the shelves. Suddenly, she saw something that made her gasp. A hidden door behind a stack of boxes. With trembling hands, Emily pushed the boxes aside and opened the door. It led to a narrow staircase descending into darkness. She took a deep breath and stepped down, the stairs creaking beneath her weight. At the bottom, she found herself in an old, abandoned basement filled with cobwebs and dust. In the dim light, she saw a figure standing in the corner. It was Mark, looking disoriented and scared. "Mark!" she cried, rushing to his side. "What happened? Are you okay?" Mark looked at her with wide, haunted eyes. "I don't know," he whispered. "One moment I was in the storage room, and the next I was here. I couldn't find my way out." Before Emily could respond, a cold breeze swept through the basement, and a shadowy figure appeared before them. It was William, his ghostly form flickering in the dim light. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice a mournful echo. Emily stood her ground. "William, we know what happened to you. We want to help you find peace." William's expression softened. "They never found my body," he said. "I've been trapped here trying to warn others, but now perhaps I can finally move on." Emily and Mark followed William's ghost to a corner of the basement, where he pointed to a loose floorboard. Together, they pried it open and uncovered William's remains. The sight was both horrifying and saddening, but Emily knew this was the key to freeing his spirit. They called the authorities, and William's remains were finally given a proper burial. As they left the cemetery, Emily felt a sense of peace. The dark presence at the diner had lifted, and the mysterious disappearances ceased. Emily returned to work, but the atmosphere was different now. The diner no longer felt haunted, and the night shifts became just another part of the job. Mark was grateful to be back, and he and Emily shared a bond forged in their harrowing experience. Though the memory of that night stayed with her, Emily found comfort in knowing she had helped bring closure to a restless spirit and put an end to the diner's dark history. She continued working the night shifts, but now, she did so with a sense of purpose, knowing that sometimes, even the darkest places could find light and redemption.